The first thing I saw that morning was my neighbor standing in the middle of my backyard, waving his arms like he was directing traffic. Except there was no traffic, just a lot of muddy water and a whole lot of anger. He looked at me like I was already guilty before I even opened my mouth, and before I could ask what was happening, he pointed straight at my fence and said, "You did this." I remember standing there holding my coffee, still half asleep, thinking, did I just wake up inside someone else's argument? Because 5 minutes earlier, my biggest problem was deciding whether I had enough time to make breakfast before work. Now my neighbor was accusing me of destroying his expensive irrigation system and somehow turning his flooded lawn into my responsibility. The funny thing is, I've lived in that neighborhood for almost 8 years, and I've always believed the same thing most people do. Good neighbors don't have to be best friends. They just have to respect each other's space. You wave when you see each other. You help move a trash bin after a storm. Maybe you borrow a ladder once in a while. That's about it. Nobody expects to wake up one morning and become the villain in someone else's story. My name is Daniel Carter, and this is the story of how a broken sprinkler pipe, a stubborn neighbor, and one tiny detail hidden in a piece of plastic changed the way I looked at conflict forever. The neighbor standing in my yard that morning was Mark Ellison. Mark had moved in next door about 2 years before, and, at first, we actually got along pretty well. He was the kind of guy who loved having the nicest house on the street. His lawn was always perfectly cut, his driveway always spotless, and every weekend he had some new project going on. A new stone walkway, decorative lights, upgraded landscaping, you name it. There was nothing wrong with wanting your home to look good. But Mark had a habit of turning everything into a competition. If someone planted flowers, he planted more expensive flowers. If someone bought a new grill, he bought one that looked like it belonged at a restaurant. I never paid much attention to it because, honestly, I had enough going on in my own life. I worked long hours, took care of my house, spent weekends with my family, and I wasn't interested in winning some invisible neighborhood trophy. But Mark was different. He cared deeply about appearances. And over time, I started noticing that he cared more about being right than actually solving problems. Still, I never imagined that personality trait would eventually put us in a courtroom. That morning, the problem was obvious. His backyard was soaked. Water had spread across his grass, leaving patches of mud everywhere. His flower beds were flooded, and part of his landscaping looked like it had been through a storm. But instead of checking his own system first, he came straight to my property. "You were digging last night," he said. "I saw lights over here." I stared at him because I genuinely had no idea what he was talking about. "Mark, I took my trash out around 7. That's it. I wasn't digging anything." He shook his head like he had already decided the truth didn't matter. "Don't do that, Daniel. I know what I saw." And that sentence bothered me more than the accusation itself. It wasn't, "I think." It wasn't, "maybe." It wasn't, "can we figure this out?" It was, "I know." There's something unsettling about someone being completely certain about something they don't actually know. I walked over to the fence line with him and looked down at the ground. There was some disturbed soil near the edge of my yard, but nothing that suggested I had been digging. In fact, it looked more like the ground had shifted from all the water running underneath. I pointed that out, but Mark wasn't interested. "My sprinkler line runs right there," he said. "You damaged it." I asked him if he had checked the pipe itself. He told me he didn't need to because the evidence was obvious. That was the moment I realized this wasn't really about the pipe. It was about Mark wanting a person to blame. A few neighbors had started watching from their driveways, and I could feel the embarrassment of the whole situation settling in. There's a strange feeling when someone accuses you publicly, even if you know you did nothing wrong. Part of you still starts replaying every little thing in your head. Did I accidentally hit something? Did I forget something? Was there any chance I caused this? That's the frustrating part about false accusations. They don't just attack your reputation. They make you question your own memory for a moment. I told Mark I was happy to help figure out what happened, but I wasn't going to admit fault for something I didn't do. He didn't like that answer. He pointed at my fence again and said, "Fine, we'll handle this another way." Then he walked away. 2 days later, I found a letter in my mailbox. It wasn't a conversation. It wasn't a request to talk. It was a demand. Mark wanted $3,400 to replace his entire irrigation system. Attached were pictures of muddy ground, a cracked section of pipe, and my fence in the background. Looking at those photos, I understood why he felt confident. If someone only saw those images, they might have believed his version of events. There was water, there was damage, There was my property nearby, but something about the pictures bothered me. The crack in the pipe didn't look like something that had been hit or crushed. It looked strange, almost like it had expanded from the inside. I didn't know much about irrigation systems, but I knew enough to know that damage doesn't always happen the way people assume. I called a friend of mine, a retired contractor named Luis Romero, and asked him what he thought. He looked at the pictures and paused for a long time. Then he said something that stuck with me. "Daniel, don't look at where the pipe broke. Look at how it broke." At the time, I didn't realize that one sentence was going to become the reason I walked into court with confidence instead of fear. Because Mark thought he had already won, he thought the muddy pictures told the whole story. He thought pointing a finger was the same thing as proving a fact. But he had missed something important. The truth doesn't care who tells the louder story. It only cares about the evidence. And a few weeks later, we were going to find out exactly what that evidence had to say. The weeks leading up to the hearing were some of the strangest weeks I can remember, not because the situation was complicated, but because of how quickly a simple neighborhood problem turned into something much bigger. Suddenly, every time I stepped outside, I felt like I was walking into a conversation I never agreed to be part of. A few neighbors had heard Mark's version of the story, and you could tell some of them were already leaning toward believing him. After all, people naturally believe what they see first. They saw his flooded yard. They saw the pictures. They saw him walking around angry, telling everyone that someone had damaged his property. And when someone looks upset enough, confident enough, and loud enough, people sometimes mistake that for being right. That's something I learned the hard way. The truth doesn't always arrive first. Sometimes, the accusation gets there before the facts do. One afternoon, I saw Mark outside talking to another neighbor near his driveway. I wasn't trying to listen, but when someone is standing 20 feet away speaking loudly, it's hard not to hear. I gave him a chance to admit it, Mark said. He could have just paid for it and moved on. I remember stopping for a second because that bothered me, not because he was angry, but because he had already decided my only acceptable response was surrender. In his mind, there was no investigation, no discussion, no possibility that he could be wrong. There was only me accepting blame. I walked over and calmly asked, "Mark, do you really believe I damaged your system?" He looked at me and said, "I know you did." That answer told me everything. He wasn't looking for the truth anymore. He was protecting his own story. I went back inside that day and started doing something I honestly hate doing. I started preparing for a fight. I'm not someone who enjoys conflict. I don't wake up looking for arguments. I'm the guy who would rather fix a fence quietly than spend 3 hours arguing about whose fence it is. But there's a difference between avoiding conflict and allowing someone to rewrite reality. I gathered everything I could find. I checked my security cameras. I reviewed the footage from the night before, and there it was. Nothing. No digging. No tools. No activity near the fence. Just me taking out the trash and coming back inside. That alone helped me breathe a little easier, but I knew it wouldn't be enough. A camera could prove I wasn't there, but it couldn't explain what actually happened to the pipe. That's when I started looking deeper. I called Luis Romero again, the retired contractor who had looked at the pictures. I asked if he would be willing to examine the broken pipe if Mark had kept the damaged section. Luckily, Mark had. In fact, he was so confident in his case that he had saved the pipe as evidence. I guess he thought holding on to the broken piece would make his argument stronger. Sometimes people accidentally preserve the very thing that proves them wrong. Luis came over on a Saturday morning carrying a small toolbox and the kind of calm competence you only see in people who have spent decades fixing things. He picked up the pipe section, turned it over in his hands, and studied the break. He didn't say anything for almost a minute. Finally, he looked at me and said, "This wasn't hit." "Are you sure?" I asked. He nodded. "Very sure." He explained that when something outside damages a pipe, the force usually pushes inward. A shovel, a vehicle, a piece of equipment, anything from outside leaves a certain pattern. But this crack was different. The pipe had expanded outward. The pressure came from inside. I asked him what could cause that. He gave me an answer I wasn't expecting. Frozen water. At first, I thought maybe I misunderstood him. "You mean the pipe froze?" He nodded. "Exactly. When water freezes inside a closed line, it expands. That pressure has nowhere to go. Eventually, something gives." Suddenly, everything started making sense. That morning had been unusually cold. Colder than normal. The kind of cold where you walk outside and your face immediately regrets the decision. But I still needed more than an expert opinion. I needed proof. Because opinions don't win legal disputes, evidence does. So I started collecting records. I requested weather information from the week of the incident. The temperature had dropped below freezing for hours overnight. Then I contacted the local water department to see if they had any pressure records available. I wasn't expecting much, but what they found was interesting. The night the pipe failed, there was a sudden pressure spike recorded in Mark's irrigation line. That wasn't something caused by someone digging near a fence. That was something happening inside the system. Then came the detail I never expected to find. Mark had actually kept his own maintenance records. He was proud of them. He had mentioned them several times when neighbors talked about home repairs. He liked showing people how organized he was. But when those records were reviewed, they showed something important. The irrigation system had never been properly winterized before the freeze. No preparation, no draining, no protective measures. The very thing he blamed me for had happened because of something he failed to do himself. When I put everything together, I almost couldn't believe it. This wasn't just a misunderstanding anymore. Mark had spent weeks trying to prove I caused a problem that came from his own neglect. And the most frustrating part was that I actually would have helped him if he had approached me differently. If he had knocked on my door and said, "Hey Daniel, my sprinkler line broke. Can you help me figure out what happened?" I probably would have grabbed my tools and helped him investigate. That's what neighbors do. But instead, he came with accusations, demands, and a bill. A few days before the hearing, I saw him outside again. He was loading paperwork into his truck. He noticed me watching and smiled. Not a friendly smile, a confident smile. The kind of smile someone has when they think they already know the ending. "Hope you're ready," he said. "This is pretty simple." I looked at him and said, "Yeah, it is." He laughed. "Good. Then you know you'll be paying for it." I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I just walked away, because by then, I understood something. People who are completely convinced they are right usually don't listen until something forces them to. And for Mark, that moment was coming. The morning of the hearing, he walked into the small claims courtroom carrying a folder full of photographs. He looked relaxed, comfortable, almost amused. I remember thinking he looked like someone who had already celebrated a victory that hadn't happened yet. The judge called the case, and Mark immediately started telling his story. He talked about the damaged lawn. He talked about the broken pipe. He talked about the disturbed soil near my fence. He described me as careless and irresponsible. He even said he had tried to resolve the matter peacefully, which was interesting because his version of peacefully apparently involved sending me a bill before asking a single real question. I sat there quietly and listened. I let him tell the story he had built, because sometimes the best way to reveal a weak argument is to let someone explain it completely. When he finished, he looked confident. He leaned back like the case was over. The judge looked at the documents, then looked at my side. My attorney, Rachel Bennett, had been quiet the entire time. She didn't interrupt. She didn't argue. She simply waited. Then she stood up, walked toward the table, picked up the broken pipe evidence, and asked Mark one question. Mr. Mutu's writing, "Ellison, can you explain why this pipe failed from the inside out?" The entire room changed. It was only one sentence, but it felt like someone had turned off all the noise. Mark blinked. For the first time since this whole thing started, he didn't have an answer ready. He looked at the pipe. Then he looked at the judge. And I realized something in that moment. The story he had been telling everyone was about to collide with the truth he had ignored. For the first time in weeks, Mark didn't look like the man who had been standing in my yard that cold morning, pointing his finger and acting like he had already won. He looked like someone who had just realized the ground underneath his own argument was starting to disappear. My attorney didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She simply let the evidence do the talking. The irrigation specialist explained to the judge that a pipe damage from outside pressure would show a completely different pattern. But this pipe had expanded outward because water inside the sealed line had frozen and created pressure until the material failed. Then came the records. The weather report showed freezing temperatures that night. The city water data showed the pressure spike in Mark's system. And finally, his own maintenance log confirmed the one thing he never expected anyone to notice. He had never properly prepared the irrigation system for winter. The same records he brought to prove how responsible he was ended up proving the exact opposite. The courtroom became quiet. Mark tried to explain that maybe the freezing temperatures were unusual. Maybe the pressure readings didn't mean what we thought they meant. Maybe someone else could have caused it. But every explanation sounded weaker than the one before it because the evidence had already built a complete story. The judge looked over the documents, then looked back at Mark. "Mr. Ellison," she said, "before accusing someone else of damaging your property, you need to make sure you've taken reasonable care of your own." Then she dismissed the case, just like that. No dramatic speech. No movie moment where everyone stood up and cheered. Just a simple decision based on facts. And honestly, that made it better. Because real life usually doesn't come with background music or a perfect ending scene. Sometimes justice is just a judge reading the evidence and saying, "No, that doesn't add up." Mark packed up his papers slowly. The confidence he walked in with was gone. He didn't apologize. He didn't shake my hand. He didn't admit he was wrong. And for a while, I thought that bothered me. I thought I needed to hear him say the words. But later, I realized something important. Sometimes people don't change because they admit they were wrong. Sometimes they change because reality finally leaves them no place to hide. About a week later, I saw Mark outside again. This time he wasn't angry. He was standing beside his irrigation system, actually doing maintenance. He was draining the lines, checking connections, and preparing everything properly before another freeze came through. He noticed me watching from my driveway. For a second, I thought maybe he was going to say something, maybe apologize, maybe acknowledge what happened. Instead, he just gave a small nod and went back to work. And surprisingly, that was enough. Because the biggest lesson I learned wasn't about winning a court case. It wasn't about proving my neighbor wrong. It was about how quickly people can turn a mistake into a battle when pride gets involved. Mark didn't lose because his pipe broke. Things break. Systems fail. Problems happen. He lost because he was more interested in finding someone to blame than finding the truth. And I think that's something a lot of us can understand. We've all seen it happen. In neighborhoods, workplaces, families, everywhere. Someone makes a mistake, but instead of asking, "What happened?" they immediately ask, "Who can I blame?" And sometimes that question creates a bigger problem than the original one. I still live next door to Mark. We're not best friends. And honestly, we probably never will be. But we're better neighbors now. There's a certain understanding between us. A quiet reminder that facts matter. That assumptions can hurt people. And that sometimes the smallest detail can completely change the story. So I want to ask you something. If you were in my position, would you have tried to settle with your neighbor? Or would you have taken it all the way to court once you knew you were being blamed for something you didn't do? Do you think Mark was simply embarrassed and stubborn? Or do you think people should be held accountable when they accuse others without proof? Let me know what you think in the comments. I'd really like to hear how you would have handled this situation. And if you enjoy real-life stories about unexpected conflicts, justice, and the moments when the truth finally catches up, make sure to subscribe, because there are plenty more stories coming where one small piece of evidence changes everything.